I spent years pretending my childhood was normal, smiling in family photos, laughing at holiday dinners. But the truth about what was happening under our house would make anyone sick. I'm done protecting them.
Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day.
I should have known something was off the second my parents called me. 3 years. 3 whole years of complete silence. No calls on my birthday, no Merry Christmas, not even a text, and suddenly they wanted me to house sit. Something about that alone made my stomach twist. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the way I remembered it. Same blue shutters, same porch light with a faint yellow glow. Felt frozen in time. But when I walked inside, that familiar uneasiness I'd grown up with started to creep up my spine. Then I saw it. A single, crumpled piece of paper sticking out from under the basement door. The same basement my parents had told me my entire life never to enter. Every horror movie instinct I had screamed, "Walk away, don't touch it, pretend you didn't see anything." But I couldn't. It was like a splinter under my skin. Itching, nagging, impossible to ignore. I bent down and slowly picked it up. It was an invitation, handwritten on grimy, torn paper. "You're invited to Sherry's birthday party, today, downstairs." The ink was still wet. My heart started hammering. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped it. Sherry had been my best friend. The girl who disappeared right after I left for college. The entire town had searched for her. My parents had even joined in, at least that's what I thought back then. I dialed my friend Roger. He lived just a few houses down. When he arrived, I handed him the paper without saying a word. "Wow, this is seriously messed up," he whistled, eyes flicking between me and the door. "Where'd you find it?" I led him to the basement. He knocked on the door and, in typical Roger fashion, joked, "Hello? We're here for the party." I held my breath. Nothing. I was about to tell him to knock it off when he pulled out this tiny pocket tool, crouched down and started picking at the lock. "Roger, what are you doing? My parents said there's asbestos down there. Are you trying to get us killed?" He didn't answer. He was too focused. A moment later, click. The lock dropped to the floor with a sharp metallic clang. The basement looked ordinary at first. Washer, dryer, a bin full of Christmas decorations. But the back wall didn't match the rest. The paneling was off. Roger pushed on it, and the entire section swung open like a door. Behind it, a second door. Thicker, heavy padlock. "I don't suppose you can pick this one too?" I muttered. He grinned and grabbed a hammer from my dad's old toolbox. The lock didn't stand a chance. What we found behind that door wasn't just horrifying. It rewired everything I thought I knew about my family. The room was wrapped in thick soundproof padding. Every inch of it. And in the center, chained to the floor, was Sherry. She was pale. Her hair was long and tangled, reaching almost to the ground. Her ankle was raw where the chain had rubbed the skin raw. And in her shaking hands, she clutched a metal pipe. "Stay back. I'm warning you," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Sherry," Roger said softly, frozen in place. Recognition lit her eyes like a spark in the dark. The pipe clattered to the ground. She broke down sobbing. "Please, please help me." We rushed to her, got the chain loose. I led her upstairs to my room. Her body trembled as I cleaned the blood and dirt from her wounds. She looked at us with this empty, exhausted expression and whispered, "How long?" 3 years, I said. My voice barely made it out. She closed her eyes. "I knew it," she breathed. Roger asked what happened, but I already knew in my gut it was bad. She told us everything. How my parents had called her the night I left for college, saying I'd sent a gift and they wanted to give it to her. How they'd made her tea and cookies. How she'd started to feel dizzy. How she'd woken up in chains. How every night since then, they'd come down to torment her. I wanted to vomit. She explained how she'd spent months filing away at the chain with a piece of metal she'd managed to pry loose, waiting for the right moment. The invitation wasn't for us. It was for them. A trap. Her voice turned cold. "I need to stop them before they hurt anyone else." "Sherry, no," Roger argued. "We call the cops. This is insane." "No," she snapped. "This ends now." And then, slam, the front door. "Honey, we're home early," Mom's cheerful voice called out. My heart nearly exploded. "They're here," Sherry whispered, tightening her grip around a pair of scissors she'd taken from my desk. Her entire body was trembling, but her voice was steady when she said, "I'm ending this." She hid behind my door. My parents appeared in the doorway with polite smiles that twisted the moment they saw Sherry. Mom screamed. Dad lunged. Sherry slashed at his hand, the scissors grazing his palm, and blood dripped onto the carpet I used to play on as a kid. Felt like I'd stepped into a nightmare. Roger shouted that he was calling 911 while Mom started spinning lies at lightning speed. She cried, claimed Sherry was unstable, that she'd broken into our house, that we needed to help restrain her. Dad clutched his bleeding hand, eyes sharp and calculating. Sherry stood between them and the door, scissors raised, shaking but unflinching. Then Mom's tone changed. She started crying harder, pleading with me. "Sweetheart, she was suicidal. We were protecting her." For one horrifying second, I almost believed her. That's how convincing she sounded. But then I remembered the chain, the soundproofing, Sherry's scars. The sirens grew louder outside. Mom grabbed my arm and whispered, "We're your parents. Back us up, or we go to prison." I yanked my arm away, and in that instant, something in her face changed. The sweet, fake panic vanished, and what was left was something cold, unfamiliar, real. Police officers stormed the house seconds later. Everything blurred into chaos. Shouting, questions, Sherry being pulled aside to be checked by paramedics. I watched as officers separated everyone into different rooms. I told them everything, from the first phone call to the moment they walked in. My voice didn't even sound like mine, it was hollow, mechanical. Mom kept performing in the kitchen, crying to anyone who'd listen. Dad stayed quiet, calculating. Always calculating. When Detective Hansen arrived, a woman with tired eyes that had seen too much. She listened to Sherry, then came to me. She asked everything, every detail, from childhood memories of the basement door to the moment Roger broke that lock. Each question felt like a blade peeling back everything I thought I knew. Crime scene techs moved through the house like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. Cameras flashed, evidence bags filled. One of them mentioned how professional the setup in the basement was. Soundproofing, reinforced mounts, like it was some kind of project. And in a twisted way, it was. By midnight, my parents were in handcuffs. Mom sobbed dramatically, begging me to help her. Dad just stared. That same cold, calculating stare. As they were led away, I didn't say a word. Because how do you even speak when the monsters aren't hiding under your bed? They raised you? The ambulance's lights painted soft red and blue streaks across the quiet street. Detective Hansen had gone back inside to talk to Sherry again, and when she returned, her expression was firm but gentle. "She's agreed to go to the hospital," she told me. I didn't even hesitate. "Can I ride with her?" She nodded. "Of course." Roger said he'd follow behind in his car. When I climbed into the ambulance, Sherry was already strapped to a stretcher. A thin blanket pulled up to her chest. Her hand reached out like a reflex, finding mine. She gripped it so tightly my fingers went numb. But I didn't pull away. She whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over. Her voice hoarse, trembling. I squeezed her hand back and said, "Sherry, this isn't your fault. None of this is on you." But I could tell she didn't believe me, not fully. The drive felt endless. The siren wasn't on, but the soft hum of the engine and the faint beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence. Her palm was clammy against mine, but neither of us let go. When we arrived, the hospital staff moved with quiet urgency, the kind that comes from seeing something like this before. A nurse explained gently that they were taking Sherry for a full forensic exam, standard in kidnapping and assault cases. Everything would be documented, every injury photographed, every bit of evidence collected. They wheeled her away, and suddenly the waiting room felt too big. Roger and I sat side by side in silence. Two people who had no words big enough to fill the void between us. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text. From my mom's number. "Please come home so we can explain everything properly." My chest tightened. I handed my phone to the officer posted by the door. He immediately sealed it in an evidence bag and gave me a receipt. 3 hours crawled by. Roger brought me coffee from a vending machine, but it tasted like wet cardboard. I couldn't even pretend to drink it. Around 3 a.m., a man in business casual walked in and introduced himself as Troy Hansen, a victim advocate from the county. His voice was calm and even, like he'd spent years talking people through the worst nights of their lives. He explained that his job was to help victims navigate the legal system, connect them to resources, make sure they weren't left alone in the chaos. He sat with Roger and me, outlining what would happen next: court proceedings, bail hearings, statements, protection. Then he asked to speak with me privately. "You're a victim too," Troy said softly. "Your parents used you to cover their crimes. That matters." I hadn't even thought about where I'd sleep that night. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was poisoned. Roger offered to let me stay with his family, but Troy gently pointed out something I hadn't wanted to think about. If my parents made bail, they'd know exactly where to find me. So I agreed to go to a crisis shelter. It felt strange, humbling in a way I can't fully describe, but it also felt like the safest option. Before I left, Troy told me Sherry had been admitted for at least 2 days. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and her ankle wounds were badly infected. The hospital was giving her a private room with security stationed outside. When I asked if I could see her, Troy disappeared down a hallway and returned with a nurse who guided me through winding corridors to a quiet wing. Sherry sat upright in bed, wrapped in a clean gown. Her impossibly long hair spilled across the pillow like a shadow. For lines trailed from her arm to a machine that beeped softly in the background. She looked at me, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Her eyes, they weren't the same. They held years of pain, loss, and a kind of quiet fury. She whispered that she didn't blame me, and I believed her words even if the rest of her face told a more complicated story. Grief, exhaustion, anger, pity. I didn't try to explain. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I just squeezed her hand once. "I'll be here tomorrow." She nodded and closed her eyes. I walked out before the tears caught up to me. Troy drove me across town as the first gray light of morning began to creep over the horizon. The crisis shelter was in an old brick building with security buzzers and bars on the windows. An intake coordinator met us at the door and walked me through the paperwork. They gave me a small room on the second floor. One twin bed, a dresser, a shared bathroom down the hall. Someone had stacked fresh towels and clean clothes on the dresser. Felt sterile, but safe. Troy handed me a card with his personal number. Call anytime, if you feel unsafe. If you need anything. After he left, I sat on the narrow bed, staring at the wall as the sun slowly lit the room. My parents are monsters who tortured my best friend in the basement of the house where I grew up. I repeated the sentence over and over in my head. Still didn't feel real. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. When I woke up 3 hours later, my phone was buzzing relentlessly. 6 missed calls from unknown numbers. A text from Troy told me reporters had gotten my contact info. He warned me to turn the phone off except for calls from him or Detective Hansen. I shoved it into the drawer. Everything felt heavy. My body, my thoughts, even the air. That afternoon, Detective Hansen called. She told me my parents had been officially charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. Their bail hearing was set for the next morning. She needed a formal recorded statement. Troy picked me up and drove me to the station. The interview room was small, cold, and had a camera mounted in the corner. Hansen walked me through everything again. I told her about the invitation, the basement, the hidden door, Sherry with the chain on her ankle, my parents coming home, the lies. She asked for details about my childhood. And as I spoke, things I'd ignored for years suddenly aligned into something chillingly clear. The locked basement, the constant background noise, how they never let me bring friends over, how they'd built a life designed to keep secrets. She spread crime scene photos on the table, the stairs, the false wall, the broken padlock, the mattress, the chain, the bathroom. Each photo chipped away another layer of disbelief until the truth stood there, raw and undeniable. I had to take a break when I saw the photo of the chain. My hands were shaking too hard to keep talking. Hansen gave me water and waited. When I came back, she showed me one last image. A tea tin. The lab had found traces of sedatives inside. The same kind they'd likely given Sherry that night. That was how it started. They were adding more charges. And they were looking into whether there were more victims. When I stepped outside the station, the night air felt too thin, too sharp. Troy walked beside me in silence, his presence steady. He told me he was taking me to meet someone who could help. Her name was Angela Richards, a trauma counselor who specialized in family betrayal cases. Angela's office was warm, softly lit, nothing like a doctor's office. She looked me in the eye when she shook my hand and didn't look away. She explained something I hadn't had a word for: betrayal trauma. The numbness, the guilt, the waves of rage, the confusion. All of it was normal. She didn't try to fix me. She just listened. By the time the hour was up, I felt less like I was screaming into a void. She gave me her card. Call me anytime, she said. You don't have to carry this alone. That night at the shelter, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my life had been split clean in half, before the basement and after it. Roger texted me. Reporters were already outside his house. The neighborhood was swarming with news vans. He sent me a link to an article. Suburban couple arrested for holding woman captive for 3 years. There was a photo of my childhood home wrapped in yellow tape. They didn't use my name, just the couple's adult daughter who discovered the victim. It made me sound like a hero, but I wasn't. I just stumbled into a nightmare that had been living under my feet all along. And now everyone knew. Troy picked me up early the next morning for the bail hearing. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. My parents standing over me, their faces twisted into smiles while I was the one chained in that dark basement. The kind of dream that doesn't feel like a dream at all. He handed me a cup of coffee as I climbed into the car. You don't have to go inside, he said gently. You can wait in the victim services office if you want. But no, I needed to see this. I needed to look those 2 people in the eye and watch what happened next. The courthouse was old and grand, with cold marble floors that made every footstep echo like a gavel. High ceilings, heavy wooden doors. It felt like walking into some place meant to crush people smaller than it. Troy led me through security, then up to the 3rd floor. The courtroom smelled like paper, old varnish, and tension. We sat in the back row. I recognized faces in the gallery, neighbors, people I'd grown up around. People who'd probably come just to see the monsters for themselves. My parents were brought in through a side door. Orange jumpsuits, shackled hands. Mom looked smaller than I remembered. Hair tied back, no makeup, shoulders slumped like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Dad, on the other hand, held himself straight-backed and sharp, like he was walking into a board meeting instead of a bail hearing for kidnapping. They sat down at the defense table beside their lawyer, a slick guy in a tailored suit named Milo Torres. When the judge entered, everyone rose. And then the real show began. The prosecutor, Celine Hansen, Detective Hansen's sister, stood first. Her voice was strong and steady, filling the room with each word. She laid it all out like a hammer hitting steel. First-degree kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, administering drugs without consent. She painted a picture of the basement room, the soundproofing, the chain, the padlock. She described Sherry's injuries in clinical, chilling detail. Malnutrition, infection, trauma. 3 years of it. She called my parents a danger to the community. Said they'd constructed an elaborate, deliberate prison to hold a human being. She asked the judge to deny bail entirely. Then Milo stood, and the tone in the room shifted. He spoke softly, warmly, like my parents were victims of some tragic misunderstanding. He told the court they were respected members of the community, pillars of the neighborhood, with no criminal record. He painted Sherry as someone who chose to stay at first, and said everything had simply gotten out of hand. He described my parents as stable, kind people who deserved the presumption of innocence. And the worst part? For a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, I almost believed him. But then I remembered the chain on Sherry's ankle, the soundproofed walls, the 3 lost years. I gripped the wooden bench so hard my knuckles turned white. Milo asked for reasonable bail, GPS monitoring, and regular check-ins. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the documents, asking both sides questions. His face gave nothing away. Finally, he spoke. Bail. $500,000 each. Conditions. Surrender passports, GPS monitoring, no contact with me or Sherry, and mandatory court check-ins twice a week. Mom started sobbing loud, wet, performative cries that echoed through the courtroom. Dad didn't even flinch. Troy leaned toward me and whispered, "That's high. Most people can't post that kind of bail." I let out a shaky breath. Maybe they'd actually stay behind bars. But 3 hours later, while Troy and I were at a diner, his phone rang. Dad's brother had posted bail. My stomach turned cold. They were out. Not free, but out. Troy's expression tightened. He updated my safety plan right then and there. I wasn't to go anywhere alone. Not even to the corner store. If I saw them or even thought I did, I was to call him immediately. That night, food felt like ash in my mouth. 2 days later, Troy called to tell me Sherry had been discharged from the hospital. They were moving her somewhere safe. Somewhere my parents didn't know about. She texted me from her new number later that afternoon. She wrote that she couldn't sleep, that every sound made her flinch, that knowing they were out on bail made her feel like they'd show up at any moment and finish what they started. I typed out something reassuring, something about GPS monitors and how they couldn't come near us. But even as I hit send, I felt the hollowness of it. Those monitors only told the police where someone had been, not where they were going next. She didn't text back. And honestly, I didn't blame her. The next afternoon, Detective Hansen called. Her team had traced the purchases: soundproofing, heavy chains, industrial padlocks. My dad had bought everything 3 months before Sherry disappeared. Some in cash, some on a credit card. Premeditation. Cold. Calculated. I thought back to that summer. Him telling me he was soundproofing the basement for a home theater. Mom laughing about how he never finished his projects. I told Detective Hansen and she wrote it all down. That detail, she said, would be key in proving intent. After I hung up, I sat on my bed at the shelter, feeling sick. They'd planned all of this while I was still under their roof, eating dinner with them every night. A week later, Detective Hansen picked me up to collect my belongings from the house. The yellow tape was gone, but the house felt wrong, like someone had pressed mute on the world. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of my childhood hit me, and it made my stomach twist. Everything was exactly the same, except it wasn't. The living room furniture was arranged just so, carefully angled so no one could see the basement door. The family photos on the walls were all perfect smiles, perfectly staged. The white noise machine still sat on the hall table, humming softly. I walked through it like a stranger touring a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. Upstairs, I packed my clothes into a duffel bag, hands shaking. The bed where I'd slept while Sherry screamed beneath my feet, I could barely look at it. Then, buried beneath some old sweatshirts, I found them, my high school journals. I opened one. Heard weird noises again tonight. Mom says it's just the neighbors. Dad says animals. Another entry. Dad got mad when I asked about having friends over. Said our house isn't right for sleepovers. Another. Mom watching Sherry at dinner. That weird, intense look again. Page after page of tiny warning signs I'd buried as meaningless teenage moments. But seeing them now, all at once, they formed a clear, terrifying pattern. I handed the journals to Detective Hansen. She asked if she could log them as evidence. I said yes. I didn't want them near me anymore. On the drive back to the shelter, Hansen's face was unreadable, but her voice was serious. They were investigating whether my parents had hurt other people. She explained that people who build something as elaborate as that basement, they rarely start there. There's usually a pattern, a history. She asked if I remembered any other disappearances, any strange behavior. I thought of a girl from middle school who moved away suddenly, a college student from the next town who vanished when I was in high school. I gave her both names. She wrote them down carefully. "You did the right thing," she told me. But as I carried my bags back inside the shelter, the thought clawed its way into my chest and wouldn't leave. How many other Sherrys had there been? And how had I lived under their roof, without ever knowing? 2 days later, Troy called. His voice sounded different this time, low, worn down. He told me Sherry had just finished her forensic interview with Detective Hansen. 6 hours. 6 hours of going through every detail of what my parents had done to her over 3 unbearable years. The detective had been working to build a precise timeline for the prosecution. And apparently, Sherry remembered far more than anyone expected. Dates, times, the sounds, what they said, what they did. Troy said she'd stayed strong through most of it but completely broke down afterward. I could hear the heaviness in his voice, and my chest tightened, imagining her sitting in some interview room reliving all of it. Because my parents had put her there. The next morning, I got a call from a woman named Celine. She introduced herself as the assistant district attorney handling the case. "Can we meet?" she asked. "It's time to talk about testimony." The word testimony made my stomach twist. But that afternoon, I sat across from her in her office, watching as she opened a thick folder. The case file. My life and Sherry's pain reduced to stacks of paper and photographs. She explained that my testimony about the day I found Sherry, and what my parents did when they came home, was critical to the case. Then she asked point blank if I was willing to testify against them in court. The room felt smaller suddenly. The idea of sitting in that courtroom, staring at my parents while calling them what they were, criminals, made me want to throw up. But I looked at Celine and I thought of Sherry. I told her, yes, I'll do whatever it takes to help her get justice. She nodded, firm but kind. Then she explained what to expect. Cross-examination, the defense trying to undermine me, paint me as unreliable, maybe even suggest I misinterpreted what I saw. The thought terrified me. What if I messed it up? What if I said one wrong thing and it cost Sherry everything? That evening, Roger called. His voice was shaking. Someone had left a note on his parents' doorstep. "Keep your mouth shut about things that don't concern you." No name, no signature, just the threat. He took photos and called Detective Hansen right away. She didn't brush it off. She immediately arranged for extra patrols in his neighborhood and started investigating the source. Roger was scared, I could hear it, but he was also furious. "I'm not backing down," he said. "I saw what I saw. I'm testifying." 3 days later, Detective Hansen called me with an update that made my hands go cold. The forensic lab confirmed that the sedatives in the tea tin matched exactly with what they found in Sherry's blood, and they had my dad's DNA under her fingernails, proof of the struggle when she tried to escape. Even the wounds on her ankle matched perfectly with the chain pulled from the wall. Piece by piece, the case was locking into place. Hansen's voice was calm, but beneath it, I could hear the satisfaction of someone who had built a bulletproof wall of evidence. A week later, Celine called again. Milo Torres, the defense attorney, had reached out. He wanted to talk plea deal. My parents might plead guilty if it meant shaving down their sentence. Celine told me she shut him down immediately. "Not unless they admit everything and face real prison time," she said. "They don't get to rewrite this." Her resolve steadied something inside me. I started seeing Angela twice a week. She called what I was feeling grief. Not for dead parents, but for the people I thought they were. Angela said something that stuck with me. Loving someone and acknowledging what they did aren't mutually exclusive. She taught me breathing exercises for the moments when the weight in my chest felt crushing. And she reminded me that feeling conflicted didn't make me weak. It made me human. One night, long after midnight, Sherry texted me. "I can't sleep. I keep seeing them in my dreams." I called her immediately. She told me about the nightmares, about my parents breaking in, dragging her back, locking the door behind her. I told her about the GPS monitors, about how they weren't allowed near her. But fear doesn't care about legal boundaries. It lives in the shadows. "Do you think they'll actually go to prison?" she whispered. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to promise. But I couldn't. Detective Hansen later found another piece of the puzzle. She'd pulled 5 years of utility records from my parents' house. There were huge spikes in energy use starting 4 months before Sherry disappeared. Exactly when they'd installed the soundproofing and lights. Proof that they'd planned every inch of this nightmare. 3 weeks after the arrest, Troy called. My uncle, Dad's brother, wanted to meet me. He says they want to explain their side. Troy told me, his voice tight, their side. Like there was a version of events where chaining someone in a basement was somehow justified. Troy said meeting them was a bad idea for the case, for my mental health, for everything. I agreed immediately. I didn't want to hear a single word from them. A few days later, Roger texted and asked to meet. Neutral Ground, a coffee shop near the shelter. He looked tired, worn down but determined. He admitted that the threat had shaken him. That for a moment he'd considered backing out. But then he thought of Sherry chained in that basement for 3 years and realized silence would make him part of the problem. He was going to testify, no matter what. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You're a better friend than I deserve." He shook his head. "This isn't about deserving. It's about doing the right thing." We didn't need to fill the silence after that. Just existing in the same space felt real. 2 days later, someone knocked on my door at the shelter. A stranger handed me an envelope. My name was written in my mom's handwriting. My fingers started shaking. She wasn't supposed to contact me at all. Inside, on her favorite floral stationery, was a letter. She wrote that she loved me, that everything they'd done to Sherry was to protect her from herself. She said Sherry had been suicidal, that the chain, the locked room, the manipulation, it was all to keep her safe. She called it care. It was torture. She ended the letter begging me to visit, to hear her out, to remember she's still my mother. I took photos of every page, then called Detective Hansen immediately. When I brought the letter to the station, Hansen met me in the lobby. She took it with gloved hands, sealed it in evidence, and documented everything. Mom had just violated her bail conditions. Hanson's voice was steady but hard as steel. Judges don't take kindly to defendants ignoring orders. This will not go well for her. And it didn't. At the bail revocation hearing, the courtroom was smaller, quieter. No crowd this time. Celine presented the letter as evidence. Milo tried to frame it as a mother reaching out in a moment of distress. The judge didn't even let him finish. He revoked her bail on the spot. As they led her away, Mom looked at me with that same wounded, manipulative expression she'd always used when I was a kid. The look that used to make me fold. But not anymore. Dad stayed out on bail but under a microscope now. Any slip up and he'd be next. Troy took me to his office afterward, where Sherry was waiting to finalize a protective order against both of them. She looked stronger, not healed but steadier. The order legally barred my parents from coming within 500 feet of her. Any violation meant immediate arrest. She signed the papers with hands that didn't shake. And when she tucked them into her bag, I saw her shoulders drop just a little, like she could finally exhale. And for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of something on her face that wasn't fear. It was resolve. Detective Hanson called me back into the station a few days later. Same interview room, same cold walls, same hum from the fluorescent lights overhead. But this time, the questions weren't about that night, they were about before. About my childhood. About every moment that, in hindsight, should have told me who my parents really were. I sat there gripping the edge of the table, forcing myself to piece my memories together like puzzle fragments. I told her how my parents had slowly cut ties with my dad's family. It wasn't all at once. First, fewer visits. Then canceled holidays. Eventually, no calls at all. Some big fight that they never fully explained. Just, they don't respect our privacy. Then I described the way they discouraged me from bringing friends over. Always an excuse. The house was messy. They were tired. They needed quiet. They were obsessed with privacy. Extra locks on every door, cameras pointed at the driveway, constant questions about where I was and who I was with. When Detective Hanson asked if they'd ever tried to control my friendships, something clicked. I remembered how they'd subtly warned me about Sherry, saying she was too clingy, a bad influence, or too intense. I hadn't thought much of it back then, but now it felt like a sick strategy. They'd been grooming their environment for years, isolating me, cutting off outside connections, building the perfect bubble to hide something monstrous. The detective recorded every word. This pattern of control, she told me, it'll help show intent and predatory behavior. A few days later, I met with Celine again, this time in her office. She sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and steady, unflinching eyes. She walked me through what a trial would actually look like. Jury selection, testimony, cross-examination, verdict. She explained how the defense might try to twist things, to make it seem like I misunderstood what I saw, or that I was emotionally unstable, or that I had some hidden motive. She said good defense attorneys are ruthless, and their job isn't to find the truth. It's to make the jury doubt. She didn't sugarcoat anything. Testifying about your parents' crimes in front of a room full of strangers can break people, she said softly. But the evidence here is overwhelming. If they're smart, they'll take a deal. I asked her what would happen if they didn't. Her answer was simple. Then both you and Sherry testify. You tell the jury exactly what happened. The thought made me nauseous, but I said yes. If it came to that, I'd do it. The next few weeks were a blur of legal preparation. Celine's team pulled everything together into one massive case file. Utility records showing strange power spikes in the basement before Sherry disappeared. Receipts proving my dad bought soundproofing and restraints months in advance. Forensic evidence tying their DNA to the chain and the T-tin. Medical records documenting Sherry's injuries, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Eyewitness statements from me, Roger, and Sherry about the night we found her. Every piece fit together like the bars of a cage my parents had built. Celine told me Milo Torres had reached out again. Another plea offer, more serious this time. My parents were starting to understand they couldn't win. She made it clear. No deal would be accepted unless it included real prison time and a full admission of guilt. No minimizing. No pretending this was anything other than what it was, kidnapping and torture. When the formal charges were finalized, Celine called to walk me through them one by one. Kidnapping in the first degree, for taking Sherry by force and holding her for years. False imprisonment for keeping her locked in that basement. Aggravated assault for the injuries, the torture, the psychological damage. Administering drugs without consent for the sedatives in the tea. Each charge carried years. She explained the difference between concurrent and consecutive sentencing, how one would let them serve time all at once, and the other would stack the sentences like bricks. She told me they were seeking consecutive sentencing. If the judge agreed, my parents could spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Over the next 2 weeks, the negotiations turned into a tug of war. Milo pushed hard for concurrent sentences and language that made the whole thing sound like some situation that got out of hand. Celine refused every time. She demanded allocution. That they'd have to stand in court and admit what they did, detail by detail, no sugarcoating. I told her not to accept anything less. I didn't care if it took months. And while the lawyers argued in conference rooms, my life became a quiet, unwanted spectacle. When details of the charges hit the media, everything exploded. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Reporters hounded the shelter. Troy helped me sneak out back exits, timing everything like a covert mission. He kept reminding me, "You don't owe the public a single word." I clung to that. 3 weeks later, Celine called with news that felt both heavy and final. My parents had accepted the plea deal. They pleaded guilty to every single charge: kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and administering drugs without consent. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to recommend 25 to 30 years, with the possibility of parole only after the minimum was served. They'd be in their late 70s before they could even ask to get out. And violent offenders rarely get parole on their first try. Celine's voice was steady as she explained it. But for me, the words hung in the air like a door slamming shut. For the first time, it truly felt over. Not clean, not easy, but final. 2 weeks later, Celine brought both me and Sherry into her office to prepare us for the plea hearing. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She explained exactly how it would go. The judge would question my parents to make sure they fully understood what they were pleading guilty to. Then they'd have to say it out loud, every single thing they'd done, every detail, for the record. And then it would be our turn. We'd both have the chance to read victim impact statements, telling the court how their crimes changed our lives. Celine told us to be honest, specific, and unafraid to show emotion. "This becomes part of the permanent record," she said. "It matters." The next few days were hard. I worked on my statement with Angela during our therapy sessions. Every version I wrote felt wrong. Too angry, too sad, too detached. How do you put into words what it feels like to discover your parents are monsters? Angela kept reminding me, "There's no perfect way to do this. Whatever you say will be enough." Eventually, I structured it into 3 parts. The betrayal, how everything I believed about my childhood was a lie. The grief, losing the parents I thought I had. The guilt, for living my life while Sherry was suffering beneath the same roof. By the 4th draft, it still hurt to read. But it was true. Sherry met me at a coffee shop near the shelter and showed me hers. Her statement was brutal and beautiful. She wrote about the physical torture, the psychological manipulation, the years spent wondering if she'd ever be found. She described the nightmares that still haunted her, the panic attacks, the claustrophobia, the way certain sounds could yank her right back into that basement. At the end, she wrote, "They stole 3 years of my life. They broke me, but they didn't destroy me. I'm still here." Her hands shook when she said she was terrified to read it in court. I squeezed her hand and promised I'd be right there. She wouldn't face them alone. The night before the hearing, I lay in my narrow bed at the shelter, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything like a film reel I couldn't pause. The invitation by the basement door, Sherry chained up, Roger breaking the lock, my parents coming home, the arrests, the bail hearing, the evidence, the plea deal. Tomorrow, they would stand in front of a judge and say what they did out loud. And something inside me knew it would never feel truly over, but this was the beginning of an ending. Troy picked us up early to avoid the worst of the media swarm. But the courthouse was already packed. Reporters, cameras, people who wanted to catch a glimpse of the couple who kept a woman prisoner for 3 years. Troy led us through a side entrance and into a small waiting room with bad coffee and hard chairs. Around 9:30, a bailiff came for us. We entered through a side door, away from the chaos. Judge Patrick Stevenson was already on the bench, a serious man in his 60s whose expression said everything. He understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. My parents were led in wearing orange jail uniforms, wrists and ankles in restraints. They looked smaller, diminished. Mom's eyes found mine. I looked away. I was done giving her any part of me. The allocution lasted over an hour. The judge questioned them charge by charge. They had to admit everything. How they planned to kidnap Sherry. How they lured her with the lie about a gift from me. How they drugged her tea. How they carried her downstairs to a basement they'd spent months preparing. How they chained her there for 3 years. How they tortured her. How they threatened her family. Mom cried at parts, those familiar tears that once made me believe she cared. Now they just looked like performance. Dad's voice was flat, cold, like he was reading a grocery list. Then it was time for the victim statements. Sherry went first. She walked to the podium, hands trembling but head held high. Her voice only shook a few times as she read. Every word was like a blade cutting through the silence. People in the gallery wiped their eyes. When she finished, she looked directly at my parents. "I hope every single day of your sentence reminds you of what you did to me," she said. Then it was my turn. I walked up, feeling my legs threaten to give out, but I didn't stop. I told the court about the parents I thought I had versus the monsters they really were. About how every birthday, every family dinner, every Christmas was staged on top of a basement prison. I talked about the betrayal, the grief, the guilt I carry for not seeing it, and how I was determined to help Sherry heal, even as I learned how to heal myself. My voice cracked halfway through, but I didn't stop. Judge Stevenson listened silently. When we finished, he took a deep breath and said, "Given the severity and duration of these crimes, the court sentences the defendants to 28 years in state prison." Mom tried to catch my eye one last time as the bailiffs led them away. I stared straight ahead. Sherry grabbed my hand. We walked out of the courtroom together, through the side exit where Troy was waiting. Outside, the sun was bright, warm, real. We stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the air like it was new. The legal nightmare was over. My parents would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But Sherry and I, we were free, and our healing was just beginning.
Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.